All right, let's get started. Welcome, 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 everybody. Thank you for joining us. The title of this webinar is America's Ideals Saved Us Before, and They Can Save Us Now. We are joined by Johnny Davis and hopefully soon his lovely wife, Suziann, who's currently stuck in traffic. It's the one of the occupational hazards of living in the DC area, but hopefully she'll get here and we can get some of her insight as well. And we are joined right now by Johnny Davis, who is an incredibly eloquent and intelligent and well-read speaker. He's very, very aptly flanked by two of our great presidents in the background there. Mm-hmm. And what we'll be covering is the founding principles and what the founding fathers believed. You know, what are the key principles of the Declaration of Independence? How can we use the founding principles to solve the issues that we're struggling with today? Right. The argument is that the founding principles are as relevant today as ever before, and they have the potential to mend the current societal issues and move us forward. But unfortunately, there's some pushback to these ideas. So we're going to discuss all of that stuff. But first, Johnny, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yes, I'm Johnny Davis. I'm an international constitutional law attorney. I'm a professor at Liberty University. I'm also a reserve JAG who specializes in national security law. I actually originally grew up in rural Alabama, and I currently live in the DC area. That's my very short synopsis of my background. So the key fundamental question we have at hand is basically, do we have a republic that simply needs to be abolished because it's inherently, immoral and worthless? Or is our real problems today, because at this point, it's obvious that we are in a mess? Or is there a problem that we've departed from our principles and that we need to return to our principles? Another way to style this question is very important is the fundamental theme of American history, racism, as some allege, or is it the struggle for liberty? Now, I don't diminish the issue of racism at all. In fact, I would say it's probably true if you look at the span of our history, the issue of racism is probably our number one problem, or at least the number one thing people have used to do as the excuse to get away with doing evil. I think the other motives have been involved, but it's always been the good way to reach a lot of the masses. And the thing I think we first have to look at is to look at the founding fathers. And I think one of the overriding things that they had in mind that helps drive the rest of things, and a theme I think needs to drive our whole analysis, is Augustine's theme in City of God. And his argument is that basically life in general can be looked at as a struggle between virtue versus lust for dominion. And particularly when it comes to the republic, that a republican liberty can only flourish through virtue, not just in government, but in society as a large, and that man has a natural tendencies for the lust of dominion, and that if you're driven for lust for dominion, you will have tyranny, and that if in our personal lives we're driven by the lust of dominion, we will, in fact, be subjected to tyranny. So
let's get into a little bit of detail about the, what exactly the founding principles are, and what did the founders believe? What was it they were trying to do, and what were those exact principles that we're talking about? Let's lay them out very specific.
The first principle, I think, coming off of that Augustine principle, is that character is destiny for individuals and nations. And when you understand that, it keeps you in mind that the most important thing is always actually what's happening with the culture, and then what happens with politics is secondary, contrary to our modern society where we think of politics as first and foremost, and who cares what's going on with the culture. The other principle is the idea that man was made in the image of God, and as a result, we had individual rights that were enabled, didn't come from government. In fact, that belief meant redefine the nature of government. Government's primary purpose then is to protect those rights. And also, that gave also a belief that man had the potential to achieve great nobility. Now, they recognize man's propensity to do great evil, and we're seeing that flourish today. But this idea of being made in the image of God also recognized man has an ability to achieve greater heights and nobility than he's ever actually achieved. And so, and then those exception little things where we achieve great things, that could be our normality. It hasn't been through our history, but it could be. And so we shouldn't cheat ourselves by settling for far less and allowing cynicism. And
Mm,
those are the bedrock principles from which the rest come. And also, it's also important to understand their sense of rights, because rights are what produce liberty, but they only produce liberty when you properly understand what a right is. It comes from God, it's innate to humanity, but with it comes duties. See, but a duty is something that you hold towards each other as human beings, towards your family, towards society as a whole. A duty is not something that government enforces, because if the only way you're going to do right is government enforces, by definition, we're not going to be a free country. We're going to be in a state of tyranny. So, as voluntarily doing our duty is essential to maintaining liberty. And so, what's then vital is not just a dog eat dog individuals and we're only care about ourselves, but by having flourishing families, flourishing churches, flourishing community organizations. Culture has to be healthy. And that's why they warned us that the people have to be religious and moral and
mm,
voluntarily so. Not they did had separation of church and state because they understood the idea of government making you be moral and making you do right is never going to work. Another thing I'd want to emphasize too here is someone who's very secular or even atheist doesn't need to be scared by this use of God, because keep in mind, this was actually Jefferson who penned these words in the Declaration, was probably the furthest from Christianity of any major founding father.
mm,
And I think now, to sure, we can't remind exactly what was going on in this mind, but I think one thing he would agree is that even if he wasn't sure about God, he understood that history was driven by narratives. And he understood this is the narrative that works. Just like in the Roman Republic, they had narratives around their gods driving their republic. And many of them didn't believe in their gods, but they understood this narrative is important. So this is a narrative that works that we all can rally around.
mm,
And it also doesn't mean you have to be a Christian, Jew, or whatever, because all the major faiths recognize man has a higher nobility he and she is capable of achieving, and that we need to aspire that way. As
mm,
well, in our discourse to each other, we don't claim that we know the truth and have the truth, but that we agree with each other that in our discourse with each other, we'll jointly seek the truth.
mm.
That's very essential. Right now, in our modern day discourse, we don't have a joint seeking the truth. We have each clobbering each other, and we have two opposing camps that demand that each other that everybody conform, rather than we can disagree, but what we've agreed upon is we will jointly, voluntarily seek to carry out the truth.
Right.
Now, obviously, one of the first things then we have to address is the contradictions, because did the founding fathers fully live up to these principles? No,
Right. That
they
was
didn't.
my next question was about the inherent tensions there, right? Because all
Right.
those lofty principles, all those beautiful sentiments, they were aspirational for sure, because they were certainly not being put into practice for quite a long time,
Mhm.
even after these founding principles were established. Namely, the elephant in the room is chattel slavery, the institution of slavery on American soil, even while we're going around sort of touting this principle of all men are created equal. We are all created in the image of God, whatever that will mean for people, and that we all have inalienable rights. So there's a significant subset of the population that did not get these rights, that did not get this treatment, that was not granted this dignity. And so let's talk a little bit about that, about those tensions and what was going on at the time with the founders and how were they grappling with those
Right.
ideas.
Well, keep in mind at this point, slavery in one form or the other was virtually universal throughout the world.
Right.
So, what was different is that you had somebody raising up some principles that challenged the whole system. And the thing is, it's a hard struggle throughout history for the good to achieve, because knowing what's right and doing it are two different things.
Mm,
And the course of history is progress. Even once you figured out the truth, it's very hard to get there. But one thing that should be kept in mind on the upside is that after the Republic was founded and the Constitution put in place, you did have the northern and central states in slavery, which was one of the first places on the planet that occurred. So that was a major progressive event. Now, what specifically happened here, there was a political compromise because you read the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. It's not that that was a lie and they didn't believe it. You have that notion out there, but the first people who ever argued that the Declaration didn't mean what it said were the defenders of slavery, because they recognized to uphold slavery, you have to tear down the Declaration of Independence, because there is no reconciling the Declaration of Independence principles and slavery.
And actually, we can even back up, because I was recently at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History, and they showed multiple drafts of the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, where he's trying to figure out the way to grapple with this particular problem, because obviously it's going to just be hitting you right in the face.
Well, what Jefferson, his first draft that he wasn't able to get passed, he actually condemned slavery, wanted us to commit that the revolution was going to be about ending slavery then. And not only that, one of the grievances listed for why we break away from the King of England is because the monarchy had introduced slavery and the slave trade to the colonies and inflicted this curse of slavery upon it. And that was one of the reasons for breaking away. An important thing is, look at the grievances. We always hear about taxes, taxes, taxes. That was not the primary issue. It's one of the things that started the feud, but if it had only been about leaving taxes, they would have never declared independence. Their focus was of the abuses of power and the violations of the rule of law by the King of England, which climaxed with him using military force against the colonies, and they fought back. They were desperately trying to struggle to avoid it. So again, it was about the violation of these individual rights that this revolution was physically even fought for. It wasn't just an abstract notion that wasn't very relevant. That's what it was really about. And taxes were actually a subset issue. And even there, they weren't just concerned the taxes are too high. It was an individual liberties thing even there. And of course, obviously
what happened to the draft? Tell us about.
Well, the draft didn't get stopped because particularly the slave Pinckney, the leader of the pro-slavery crowd from the Carolinas, was the one who said basically, we won't go along with the revolution. We're going to nuke the whole revolution if you don't do it. He was adamant about that. And so the founding fathers were faced with the choice that if we try to abolish slavery now, we're absolutely going to lose for sure. The revolution is going to die from the beginning. And that means no progress in slavery is going to be made, because the king's not fighting to end slavery. We were the first ones that did the abolishing of slavery, and then that helped prod England into following suit. So it was one of those things where you have to make a compromise in order to make any progress at all. That doesn't mean it's right. We can go back and try to hindsight and try to second guess a better way to do it. But the important thing is to understand the earnestness of the principles was there. There may indeed be failures of leadership that some smart person in hindsight can say, I can figure out a better way. This is what Jefferson should have said. Hey, I'm not saying that the compromise was morally good and all for the compromise. The important thing that we need to understand now is that the principle really was there, and it was a real principle. And it's all about not fully living up to the principle. Because if the principle was never there, then we don't have a republic with any moral authority. If it's a principle that wasn't fully lived up to, then what we have to focus in on is living up to it.
Yeah, and we're going to go there next, but I wanted to dig a little bit deeper because, even Jefferson himself owned slaves and famously, bore children with slaves. So that tension is happening within a single man.
Oh,
right? The same
absolutely
being who's writing these principles down and, condemning slavery owns slaves. So, I'm not a historian. I'm not an expert by any means at this, but, the first question that comes to mind is, well, why didn't Jefferson at least himself walk the walk? Why didn't he just free his slaves?
Well, I'd say a couple of things about that. The first thing is, even when he's writing this, he's actually writing this as a representative of the Continental Congress as a whole. So it's not necessarily that Jefferson at any moment in his life fully lives up to this. The other thing I would say too is that I think the arc of Jefferson as a whole, we can't spend too much time doing that, but I think the younger Jefferson was a better man than the older Jefferson. Some people get better in their lives. I think that the bottom line is this: the course of Jefferson is he shrank as a person over time. He became more vain. He became jealous. He was a romantic who became frustrated in romanticism. So he flat out didn't live up to his principles. And I think part of it was he was a romantic who was frustrated in his romanticism, and he became more cynical.
Right.
The other thing too about the fathering of the slaves, I don't think that was some sexual use and lose. I think that was just about a common law marriage, and that he was truly in love. I think Jefferson's relationships were always romantic. It was illegal for him to actually marry at that time. And their affair seems to start after his wife died, never during his wife. So that's my thesis about it. I don't deny that he fathered slaves by children by a slave, but I think it was actually a romantic relationship. I don't think it was one of these sexually predatory things like you often saw with so many slave owners.
I think, the thing that you hear all the time, though, is because of the inherent dynamics there, right? Sally Hemings didn't really have much of a choice, so we can't know for sure. We can't go back in time.
Oh, yeah. I'm just saying my thesis.
But yeah,
we could go on and on about it. And some people still to this day dispute that it even occurred. And there's an intellectual argument even for that. But so
right, yeah. So there's a certain extent to which we just can't go back in time, and we can't mind read. So we need both of those things in order to really settle this. But I think the point that we're both getting at here is the inherent tensions of having these very high-minded, aspirational ideals, right? That even those who crafted them couldn't live up to them or wouldn't live up to them for a variety of reasons, whether it was their own personalities, their own temperaments, or the circumstances in which they lived, or a combination of all of those things. But the point, as you mentioned, was let's try to live up to these, right? And so in the subsequent decades and centuries, we had notable figures who used those same founding principles to push America to be better than it was, and famously, one of the best examples of this for me is Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech,
right,
where he quite viciously lacerated America for its hypocrisy and its mistreatment of an entire group of people. And mistreatment is too soft a word, right? But he also made it a point to highlight how beautiful the values are and how much hope he has that we can achieve it. So why don't you talk a little bit about that, about these people
one of the great things about Frederick Douglass is his own intellectual and spiritual journey says a lot about the truth about the founding fathers, because he started from a standpoint where he thought that the republic was inherently racist. The younger Douglass would have actually agreed that the fundamental theme of America was racist. But as he studied the issue more, he came to realize that they really did mean equality in the Declaration. Frederick Douglass flat out came to embrace that was the truth of it. It was a failure to live up to it. More importantly, he came to recognize that the Constitution, like Abraham Lincoln argued, rests on the principles of the Declaration. That's very important because the Constitution doesn't give any principles. And in fact, it has some bad things in it. There was the fugitive slave clause where it said that the states were going to recognize the right of other states to retrieve escaped slaves. Right. That's a morally reprehensible clause that cannot be defended. But here's the important thing. If you recognize that the Constitution rests upon the Declaration of Independence, then you realize that what the Founding Fathers did is what they said they did. They didn't give the states the authority, they didn't give the federal government the authority to make each state in slavery, because they honestly thought each state was going to find its own way to do that. And because support for slavery was in decline, the northern and central states rapidly did end it. And there was support for ending in the South. Virginia held a state convention in the 1820s and missed by one vote, ending slavery by one vote. And if Virginia, the leading Southern state at that time, had ended slavery, there's no way the rest at that point wouldn't have wound up falling. So it's a very tragic thing that didn't occur. And so Douglass recognized that when you look at the Constitution through that lens, then you realize it wasn't actually upholding, protecting slavery. Now, if you fail to recognize that relationship, which the slave owners argued there was no relationship because, again, they knew this declaration is deadly to slavery, then you can start arguing the Constitution is a morally relativistic document and so forth. So even to our day and our current debates about what's going on, for us to even defend our republic, for us to even understand our Constitution properly, we need to understand the principles of the Declaration. But also what Frederick Douglass also understood, and as MLK later understood, those principles of the Declaration aren't just about legal interpretations for the courts, aren't even just about properly understanding our constitutional nature of the republic. They're about our society.
Right.
I mean, believing that all mankind is made in the image of God and we all have the same rights, we have the same fundamental equality in worth, not in outcomes, and societal equality, breaking through those barriers, they'll recognize even once you broke down the barriers, that takes time. That's a slow process, but the equality and value there so that you can progress through that to truly become a flourishing society is there. And those principles are what can bring that. And even there, and those were the principles were the key for healing the republic. And then what Douglass and Abraham Lincoln recognized what had happened, though, is support was for slavery was declining. But then what happened is there was a rallying around slavery in the 1820s and 1830s in the South that then led to this irreconcilable breach that leads to the Civil War. And that's because a contrary world viewpoint, an alternative world viewpoint came in to challenge that world viewpoint, those fundamental principles of the Founding Fathers. And that struggle lives with us to this day. And that's important for us to understand why we're in the mess we're in, why the Civil War even had to be fought.
Right.
Because
let's talk about that, because it's, from the way you're framing it, and from the way we're talking now, the founders' failure to mention slavery or deal with slavery on paper in the Declaration of Independence directly basically set a kind of timer, right? It kind of lit a bomb, and the fuse took about almost 100 years, right? But it basically set the stage for the Civil War, right? It made the Civil War basically inevitable, right? Because we have these principles, and we're gonna establish them and say that this is what we're living by, but we also have this incredible blight upon it that we're just pretending doesn't exist, or we're figuring out how to deal with, right? So it just seems to me that we put ourselves on an inevitable crash course with those who are in favor of slavery and those who wanted to abolish it on the basis of these principles.
Well, because of the power of those ideas and the direction we're going, I don't think the Civil War was inevitable. It was inevitable that either, like Lincoln said, a house divided cannot stand. So for the republic to flourish, slavery had to go. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. If slavery is going to be maintained, then the republic is going to fall. Because Lincoln's house divided, Lincoln didn't just mean if we're going to wind up having slavery permitted throughout the country. No, he meant the republic itself is going to fall and nobody's wind up going to be free, because he recognized what was happening in the South. In the South, because of slavery, they developed a neo-feudal society where most of the poor whites, who were the majority of whites, because they had a very, very weak middle class, had very little of their rights respected. And you had elite, the slave owners, dominating everything. So slavery means the degradation of everybody's liberty. Right. You cannot maintain slavery and then maintain the liberty of whites or anybody else. I think that inherently will destroy it.
That's a very important point that I think it took me a long time to realize. It took me, I don't know when it finally clicked in my head, but slavery didn't just hurt the people who were being enslaved. It hurt all of us. It corrupted all of us. So, and that's the inevitability that I was talking about, was we're going to reach this crossroads where either the republic does not continue, it cannot stand, or we must address this issue, because it just reaches a point where we cannot coexist with this flagrant hypocrisy, right? So,
Well, let's not leave out another achievement of the founding fathers, though. The horrible slave trade, which was a big deal. I mean, you probably had somewhere between 500 and 600,000 people die in the transatlantic slave trade. So the slave trade is a huge deal. They abolished it. And now the Constitution regretfully said you have to wait 20 years. But once 20 years came, they did it right away. And England ended their slave trade about the same time. And not because 20 years earlier they said it. It's basically the moral authority of the U.S. is going to do it, helped embarrass England, saying, we've got to do it too. If the Americans are going to do it, we can't, So it shows the power of moral authority. Doing the right thing influences other people positively a lot better than just taking a big stick and slapping people around to do, quote, the right thing. And that was a big deal, because the slave trade was a monstrous blot upon humanity. And again, and once you admit that the slave trade needs to be illegal, there's no logic where slavery then can be maintained. So that was all pointing towards slavery ending. And like I said, support for slavery was declining. And in the mid 1820s, we even reached the point Virginia by one vote missed it. Well, why didn't just 2, 3 years, 5 years later, they turn around and abolished it? And that's why I say I don't think it was ever at that point. If you don't have this contrary world viewpoint come in, then I think we would have peacefully wound up ending slavery. But what happened is, but the key is, this contrary world viewpoint only was able to get hooks into us because we still had slavery around. If we'd abolished slavery when we did, then we would have been in a much morally robust position where when this bad moral contrary world viewpoint hits us, if we don't have this weakness of slavery tainting our moral standards, then we probably would have just said, get lost. That's wrong. That's immoral. We're not going to listen to that lie. But the reason they was to get our hooks into is because we had that compromise. That was the hooks for the evil to get us into our system. And it plagues us to this day. We're haunted. And the key is you had Southern leaders like Calhoun introduce a contrary world viewpoint. And this world viewpoint ultimately stems back to some ideas that were percolating in Europe in the 19th century, coming from the 19th century German school of philosophy with Hegel and the company. And they rejected the idea that mankind was made in the image of God. They believed in evolution. The idea of evolution started before Darwin, and it really started more as a philosophical, political idea, and then they decided it was scientific as well. Keep that in mind. But we're not going to get into big debate over evolution, but I'm simply going to discuss this is how they used evolution. I'm going to leave a debate over evolution to its side, because this use of evolution was morally reprehensible. And that's all I'm talking about, is this particular use of evolution. And they added what everybody now scientifically can agree is false. They added on to this the idea that man was divided into 3 races based on evolutionary. They came up with this false idea that man first evolved from an ape into what we now think of as the Negro or black race. Then they said Asians came along, and then they say what? Well, and how does it work with evolution? The newer thing is the superior thing, the older thing is the inferior thing. And then therefore, they extrapolated from that, black's a natural slave class, white's a natural master class, therefore slavery justified. And along with it came the group identity. They weren't yet using that term, but we had the group identity ideology arise, as well as a statist ideology. The idea, contrary to what we heard before, where culture's first, society's first, it's about family, church, other institutions. The state is what everything's about. And they taught man's basic fundamental nature is mutable, changeable, and that the way you change it is with the force of the government. And we'll get into it step by step. But those ideas lead to some very sinister things.
Sure. But getting us back to the founding principles and
Yes.
Lincoln during the Civil War, during this time, how did he appeal to those founding principles in order to check all this stuff that you're describing? How did he kind of harken back? Because of the theme that we're getting at here is that those founding principles are the way we have grounded ourselves and helped ourselves improve, and that we can still do that with those principles. How did Lincoln?
What Lincoln recognized, he recognized the moral reprehensible nature of slavery. He recognized that by that point, he's becoming a national figure in the 1850s. He recognized that for a good 30 years, that heading in the right direction has been heading in the wrong direction. That belief in the Declaration principles has been declining. Calhoun openly himself rejected the principles of the Declaration, called the first two paragraphs of the Declarations were the most mistaken words ever written in the history of mankind. So he recognized that we've been departing those principles. We're becoming morally relativistic and legally positive. Yeah. And so what he warned everyone was, well, one, he brought up the principles again and reminded them of the truth that the slave defenders had rejected, that the Constitution rests on the principle of this Declaration. And then he warned people, we cannot be apathetic about this. You can't just say slavery's the South's problem. We don't care what happens to blacks, because a house divided against itself cannot stand. And like I said earlier, Lincoln meant not just it's inevitable that slavery would then become legal throughout the nation, as the Dred Scott decision tried to impose upon the country, but that it would lead to the degradation of liberty of everyone, and we would wind up in some sort of form of tyranny like was developing in the South at that time, where an elite oligarchy that was violating everyone's rights was developing.
Right. So Civil War happens. We have the Emancipation Proclamation. That's a major step forward. Yes. And then, famously Juneteenth is kind of the recognized day where it was finally the last sort of point of when it was over. And it's a beautiful thing to acknowledge and celebrate. It's a great mark of progress, but there was a lot of work to do still, right? America still had not succeeded in becoming a more perfect union, right? So then, we can fast forward to the civil rights movement and figures like Martin Luther King Jr. How did MLK use those same founding principles?
Well, of course, what happened is we passed the 13th Amendment to end slavery, passed the 14th Amendment to ensure that all the individual liberties recognized by the Declaration were fully upheld. But what happened, of course, Lincoln was martyred for freeing the slaves. And then that contrary worldview point became, the Hegelian worldview point became the force behind segregation. And then the courts eviscerated the 14th Amendment and basically pretended it meant nothing, so that you could have segregation, which totally went against all those principles.
Right.
And so we had the horrible Jim Crow thing occur. But even in this darkness, there was actually a light going on, because slavery had done great harm to the Black community. The Black family was in bad shape. But did everyone just play the victim? No. And this isn't something we talk enough about. The Black church stood up. And even in the face of their individual rights not being respected, even in the face of a powerful Klan murdering thousands of people, they brought the Black family together and made it just as strong. After a couple of generations, it was just as strong as the white family in this country. And not only that, great men like Booker T. Washington stood up, helped inspire Blacks to understand, even in the face of this persecution and this not recognizing our rights, let's get educated. Even we have to educate ourselves. Let's have Black businessmen get together and advance ourselves. We can still, through our own sweat, make progress on the societal front, even while legally they don't recognize that. And that was generation by generation occurring. And that helped set the stage for MLK, because essentially Blacks, through their own effort, had societally made great advances despite Jim Crow. And they had absolutely proved to anyone who's actually got any sense at all, even if you believe in evolution, well, they've proven they're not inferior, because even in the face of all this negativity and even in the face of murder, they've made all this progress. And they also proved another point. Fear is always a great weapon, You know, one of the things the Klan loved to use too is the threat. You know, there were a lot of whites who didn't believe in any of this, but they were afraid of what would happen if you listed those laws. Are blacks going to want revenge for all the horrible things we've done to them? And the
Right.
black church and for blacks showed them, no, we're not living in hate and resentment. We're advancing ourselves because even in the face of murder, we recognize the way to get ahead is to forgive and then advance ourselves, not to bear a chip on our shoulder. That's not how we advance.
Mm.
And so that set the stage for MLK and his message of the Declaration of the Founding Fathers and his message of love. And love, not just in saying whites, you should love blacks too, you should obey that Bible you say you believe in, but also to blacks that we will forgive.
Right.
We're not going to, we forgive even the murderous Klansmen. I guarantee you, MLK would tell us, forgive the man who murdered him, which
Yeah.
is a pretty hard thing to do because MLK's death caused a lot of harm.
Sure.
We would be, just like with Abraham Lincoln, we would be so much more blessed if Lincoln had been allowed to live and carry out his full agenda, just like MLK. If
Mm.
after the end of segregation, he could have fully helped bring his leadership to all the Reconstruction that needed to be done with the end of segregation, that leadership vacuum cursed us all, white and black, in a very mighty way. Because like with Lincoln, nobody stepped up and filled it.
Right. Right. So we have part of the conflict here, part of the issue that we're here to discuss is that there seems to be a different attitude with respect to these founding principles. It doesn't seem, or at least, there's at least a faction of people who have a different perspective on this. They don't share that sort of, they're not finding themselves being at, another stop on this sort of progression from people like Frederick Douglass, and then people like Abraham Lincoln, and then people like Martin Luther King Jr., who are looking back at those founding principles and using them to force America to become a better version of itself. We now have people who seem to, by your estimation, reject these founding principles and consider these founding principles to be either flawed or falsehoods or not fertile ground upon which to grow a future. So tell us a little bit about how you feel about this opposition. What is the character of it? What is the argument?
Well, like I said before, what we fundamentally do is we have two world viewpoints fighting each other. And in one of our problems in society, we're not taking the time to step back and ask, why am I really thinking what I'm thinking?
Mm-hmm.
And what's happening is both left and right are both deeply infected by that Hegelian viewpoint that was driving, that we've already discussed previously, like
And
group
again,
identity.
just to clarify, the Hegelian viewpoint you're talking about is this idea of human beings being subdivided into races,
Right.
and that there are fundamental differences, irreconcilable differences between them.
And the group identity mindset and the statism.
Right.
And that infects both the left and right, as well as the fundamental rejections of the principles of the founding fathers. Because one of the tragic things that happened, and there's blame on both left or the right, because the right is what we most commonly hear people say we believe in the founding fathers. But the problem is the modern right is out of touch with the founding fathers, and it goes back to the MLK days. Because modern day conservatism really got jailed in the 1960s by Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater rejected MLK. Barry Goldwater's ideas were rooted in Calhoun's ideas. He rejected the idea that the Declaration Principles were the founding document of the country. He said MLK obeys the laws he chooses to obey. Well, that's a fundamental, the founding fathers disobeyed wrongful laws themselves. So we're built on rejecting unlawful laws. MLK was standing with the founding fathers. So you have this problem that even though you see some lingo of we walk in the ways of the founding fathers, the modern day conservative movement doesn't actually do it because they haven't stepped back and really thought about where they're really coming from. And they're actually deeply influenced by Calhoun, particularly the people in high power.
Right.
And then on the left, a lot of people are well-meaning. They're crying out for justice, and they're right to cry out for justice. But many of them are getting redirected into these forces that hate the founding fathers and want to tear down the Republic's principles, when the real way for people to get the justice they want is for us to go back to the founding fathers' principles. So the way to do it is not to gather together up in our own group, a victim identity group, to get our justice, but to get away from group identity altogether and come together as one American people, and let's all come around the principles of do not deny the full personhood of any human being without any exception. That's what we have to aspire as a group to do.
Sure.
Doing that is hard. That's why we haven't done it yet. This is hard to do, but it only starts with us fundamentally doing that. And as MLK would tell us too, that also requires marrying that principle with the principle of love and saying, no, we don't seek justice. Doesn't mean seeking vengeance. Justice means we want to get things set the way they should be, but to get there, we'll forgive the wrongs of the past. And
Right.
everybody agreed to do the wrongs that have been
But
done.
what specifically about these founding principles do you think is being rejected? Like what are the arguments people are making in your view? What are they saying specifically about, if someone brings up the founding principles and say, look, these are good ideas. These are the way forward. What is the response that you've been hearing that you feel is going against it?
For the most part, what we've done in our public policy debate is we censor the ideas out. You get on Fox and the stuff we just discussed, or CNN or MSNBC, try to find anybody mention any of those ideas. The biggest thing, what they've done is they've turned it into a battle of group identity on the right versus group identity on the left, where we hate each other, call them all evil, call them all evil. And what they do is they don't successfully say, today, Calhoun addressed the founding fathers and rejected it. Today, what they've done to us, they've done the most sinister thing possible, worse than Calhoun. They've robbed us this heritage. Most Americans now, I don't think, properly understand what those principles were. The biggest thing they do is not that they rebut it, they lie about them. They deny that the founding fathers ever stood for equality to begin with. They just say the founding fathers were a bunch of bigots. They are nothing but hypocrites. So it's not that they successfully rebut the idea that all mankind should have full equality, should have full rights. They just say they're just a bunch of hypocrites. And then what they want to tell us is the only way we can get the justice we want is through getting together as a group, fighting for ourselves, and getting our revenge. And that's left and right as well, because right has its own victimhood, though they abhor the word, they are playing the victim card too today. And it's all about our group is done wrong. We're going to get back at those left. You look at our social media. It's all about we want revenge on that other group out there that has been doing our group wrong. And if everybody loses with that.
Right. So to your point, it's not so much that anybody disagrees with these founding principles, right? I mean, that's really the nature of my question, is who could disagree and what could they possibly be saying, unless those things, I mean, anything that you would say in disagreement would be objectively heinous, right? Who would be rebutting the idea that we are all created equal and that we all have inalienable rights, right? So the argument actually is, well, that was a canard anyway. That was all nonsense anyway. No one ever believed it. No one ever applied it.
Well, and I would argue too, this hasn't happened by accident, because I get back to my point about lust dominion. I think a lot of our elites in politics, business, and the media today, they are about the lust for dominion. The founding fathers' principles of virtue are in the way for their lust for dominion, because by definition, those principles don't deny the full personhood of any part of humanity, means do not live a life about dominating other human beings. Well, we have a lot of people in high power today and it's not about a party. It's about ideas. It's about belief in this Hegelian world viewpoint, who do
Mm,
believe in dominating other people, who love the idea. So they purposely want to censor out those ideas who get in our way. And again, this isn't by accident. That's part of the Hegelian philosophy. The part of Hegelian philosophy is the Hegelian dialect. And basically, it's designed to create this debate where you have this fight, but it's a fight that's kept within the Hegelian world viewpoint of statism and group identity. So
mm,
no matter what happens, you're going to ultimately go further down the road of bigger and bigger government, more and more group identity. And what you do is you treat anything else as irrelevant or not real or just foolishness.
mm,
And that's exactly what we have going on today now. And what it plays upon is humanity's dangerous herd instinct. Most people are doing what they're doing because they're following along with the herd. They're not cynically out for the dominion themselves. They're crying out for justice. They're following along in it, but they don't realize if they could read the mind of that soul league buffalo, that person is up to no good.
mm.
So the key is we've got to really start, and that's one of the great things about the founding fathers principles. They're not about surrounding yourself in a group. They're about lifting you up, empowering you so that you can stand as an individual jointly with each other, seeking the truth rather than just giving yourself out of helplessness over to
Right.
this group identity, and it's seeking for dominion, and it's seeking for revenge.
So I think that what I'm hearing is that the main problem isn't so much an abandonment of the principles themselves, but maybe a lack of faith in those principles, or an inability to even see them because people are so entrenched. Does that sound right?
Oh, I think on your own line trying to think, one, it's above us not knowing what the principles are. But even amongst a lot of people I know who do basically believe in the founding principles, a lot of them lack what I like to call, they lack the faith and the power of speaking the truth. They believe in those things, but they behave a lot more meeker fashion than I would like them to do.
Mm,
Because I'm not the only natural law person in the world, but most of the natural law crowd sort of stays in the Republican club, speaks the Republican establishment. The Republican establishment ignores the Mexican, like the little quaint fool who needs to be ignored. And my message to them, stop talking to the people who don't listen to you. You need to be speaking to large society. You need to be speaking to the minorities, because this is the message that can break the white-black divide
mm,
that's going on. But the problem there is that you have to be like MLK and Abraham Lincoln to have faith in the power of the truth, because that's what MLK was about. He understood
right.
the power of the truth, and he understood it so much. He wasn't just like today running risk that they'll lock you out of the club, they'll call you bad names. He knew he was asking to die. He knew his out death wasn't a surprise. If anything, MLK would have probably told you, "I'm surprised they didn't kill me earlier."
Mm,
It took a great deal of faith in the power of the truth for him to do what he's did. And so that's
right.
one that may be, it's the ignorance of what the founding fathers principles are, as well as understanding the fact that we have this other thing in the nature of it. Because look at what I've just described. This contrarian Hegelian viewpoint is inherently racist. And you have so many minorities who don't realize they're actually being led by leaders who, knowingly or unknowingly, are being directed by this ideology that was founded by white racists.
Mm. Yeah.
There's a there's a contradiction there, but they don't recognize it because they don't have a clear understanding of what's driving the herd. And if they
Yeah.
did, they'd realize we're being done wrong. Just like in the South, the average poor Southerner who fought for the South got sold a con game that this was about protecting the South from subjugation to the North. So this isn't the first time somebody's been conned into fighting for a cause that went against their own interests.
Of
This has
course.
happened a lot in history.
Yeah. So, it strikes me as, yeah, part of the problem being that we are fish who don't know we're wet, right? There are these overarching concepts that frame or give us a lens through which to see the world that prevent us from actually moving forward in a way that perhaps our forefathers did. Perhaps, people like MLK we're able to see through and able to say, no, this is wrong. And there's these founding principles, right?
Right. And because we're fed the lie of focusing too much on politics. Because if MLK had been waiting for the political party to come along that was going to end segregation, he'd been in trouble. He'd still be waiting.
Right.
Because there's nobody, when he comes along the scene, there was nobody run for president who says, well, if you elect me president, I'm going to make sure we enforce the 14th Amendment and we end segregation.
Right.
That guy wasn't around. So that's part of our
probably
problem
not
too.
electable.
Right. That's part of our problem. We're focused on the politics, and then we pick which poison pill of a party to fall behind in. And that debate's all toxic and poisonous, and we get consumed by that debate. We don't even understand. No. You live a life. You can speak this truth. You can live this life in your life. You can help your relationships get better. You can bring your family together. You can start healing your community.
Right.
We've got to heal the culture. That's what MLK did. He started addressing the underlying cultural thing, and then the politicians followed suit.
Right. So that, as I want to make sure we leave time for questions. I'm sure people have plenty. And for those of you who are watching and listening, please add your questions to the little Q&A section at the bottom of the menu there for you. But to wrap things up between me and you, Johnny, how can we follow the example of someone like Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King? How can we use the founding principles today to address the issues that we're facing today? How can we directly apply those principles?
Devote yourself to always speaking the truth, and to thinking for yourself, not following any group, and to focus on doing better in your life, doing your little bit part to heal the culture, and not allowing politics to be first.
That sounds so simple.
Oh, it's simple, but difficult.
Right. So what about people who say, well, while I'm busy doing that, other people are seizing political power and making things worse?
Well, to the extent you can do anything positive with politics, like when you vote, do the best you can. I mean, if you do have someone decent running, do it. Because what's happening too in most of our politics, when we do have choices, we've been tending to choose the worst of all possibilities, because we tend to vote for the person who grinds the axe the most. We've accepted the media telling us that egotistical candidates are attractive, not humble people. Remember that character is destiny. So when you, both in your lives, that means live character, but also understands when you choose a leader, be it in who you partner with, who your pastor of your church is going to be, or who you're going to vote for, look for people who are men and women of good character. And men and women of good character are servant leaders who follow virtue, not egotists who pursue the lust for dominion.
Right. Yeah. And I guess I would just add probably that, and I'm sure you would agree, that so much of what we were talking about here was about complexity and about inherent tension, and about the fact that what we're trying to do here is aspire to a greater ideal, something that transcends any individual or the flaws of any individual human being. Right. And those flaws prevent us from perfectly embodying those ideals, but nevertheless, that should be the goal. And that was true when those founding principles were written, and it's still true today. We should still be struggling against our worst angels, if you'll pardon the pun, and kind of advocating for the better ones and pushing towards that ideal as best as we can. I think the fact that it was phrased as, a more perfect union rather than a perfect union, I think is incredibly astute, and very deliberate, I'm sure.
It was very deliberate, because one important principle is to keep in mind, since we are flawed human beings, we're not going to have a utopia. Only God can bring a utopia. And when it's God really bringing it, you're indisputably know it's God, And so anybody in this life promising you utopia like Hegel, Marx, Hitler, they're going to bring you hell on earth instead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think history bears out much of that. All right, so let's take some questions. We have a few. We have Matt M saying, I heard someone suggest that the word slavery was deliberately left out of the Constitution in order to be able to have the document exist in a more perfect or ideal form in the future, once slavery would hopefully be abolished. You have any comment there? I guess the idea is we don't even want to mention slavery because it's totally going to get figured out, and we don't want this document to be so dated. I guess that's the question.
Yes, they were trying to avoid having the Constitution actually ever be interpreted as protecting slavery. And they even have a clause in there that's actually guaranteeing a Republican form of government throughout the states, but they didn't give the federal government any jurisdictional mechanism to enforce it. So that Republican form of government was really, in the context of viewing the Constitution as laying on the principles of declaration, was implying, getting to the day that we have no slavery, no denial of full equality, but no jurisdiction yet given, because there was the real hope that each state would find its way to get there on their own. But
Right.
Unfortunately, that didn't actually happen.
Yeah, that's, we are stubborn and clumsy species. What can we say? So Carrie Mendoza has a question about the founders incorporating teachings from the Old Testament into the Declaration of Independence, and also asking about how the founders viewed the Jewish community, because they were an ethnic group that was persecuted for thousands of years before America's founding. So do you know anything about that?
Oh, actually, that's one of the thumbs up we can give. America, from its earliest days, was one of the first nations to actually fully respect the rights of Jews. And in fact, you even had Benjamin Franklin. Not only did he give money to every denomination that was Christian, he actually gave charitable denominations to Jewish synagogues as well, out of great respect. And not only was this general respect, they accepted the truth that so much of the Western tradition actually came from the Jewish community and from the Old Testament. So they were doing the right thing of respecting how much they actually owed to the Jewish community. And in particular, discussing the Old Testament, well, actually, our separation into judicial, legislative, and presidential, actually, that's an Old Testament principle, because one of the principles of the Old Testament was the division of authority, and dividing into the lawgiver, the law enforcer, and the judge, and that no one could hold these different powers other than the Messiah himself when he came. And so they were directly inspired of that Old Testament principle, that one of the guards against the use of power was that there were different forms of power and they must be divided amongst different human beings. And as well as, again, Old Testament, in the image of God, that's the Genesis story. And again, that was Jews who wrote that.
Right. And, that's not to say, of course, that the Jews had an easy time in America. There was plenty of bigotry still.
Oh, yes. I'm talking about recognizing their legal rights. But even there socially, again, we can't spend too much time on it, but that's one of those going backwards. In a lot of ways, when we first started off, we had a better record. But then when you go into post-Civil War, when the Klan arises, it arises as anti-Semitic, organized as an anti-Semitic institution. Because, there's an important thing to keep in mind. When I said that Hegel, the 19th century German school philosopher, racist, it was always anti-Semitic from the start. Because when Hegel was rejecting the Christian values of like creation, he claimed that the Bible wasn't right. But at that time, he couldn't get away with just saying the Bible is false, I'm an atheist. He claimed that the Jews had distorted, and all these false ideas of like equality were part of the Jewish conspiracy. And of course, that Jewish conspiracy nonsense haunts us to this very day.
Yeah. So Nancy McDermott is wondering if you have any comments about the right to bring up our children as we see fit and how that relates to our foundational American ideals. It seems like a precondition for everything. And she feels that this is now under attack. What do you think is the best way to address this issue of, I guess to rephrase, one of the ways to adhere to those founding principles is to maintain the right to bring up our children as we see fit.
Oh, well, it definitely was one of their fundamental notions. In fact, it's one of those things in today's age, it's hard to appreciate the difference because at the founding of our nation, America was probably the most literate society the world had seen up to that time.
Hmm.
And you know what? We didn't have any public schools.
Hmm.
It was all through the family and the church and the community educating children. And they were that successful, they still made this the most literate society that had been seen on earth to that point. And in fact, because of the Great Awakenings, you had many slave masters like George Washington broke the law and taught his own slaves how to read and write.
Hmm.
Though we can't get too much at this point into that. So one of the fundamental notions is we do have to get back as a society is recognizing the parental rights fully and not violating it. It's part of our collective problem because with the statism and its collectivism, we want to treat the children like they're possessions of the state. We've got to get understanding that they're part of the family, as
Hmm.
well as, again, recognizing that we've got to solve our problems rather than always look to government to solve our problems.
Right. Yeah. So there are complexities there, but that's that would probably take a whole other webinar to work out. Um, Now, let's see. An anonymous attendee says, I read an article stating that the Civil Rights Act of 1991 basically extremely broadened the definition of discrimination in a subjective way due to emotional damage, such that our cultural existence is now suffering at the hands of our legal existence, needing to be ever more censoring in the interest of preventing such a broad scope of discrimination. Do you have any thoughts about that? I guess the broadening of discrimination to be to the point of subjectivity, where I guess somebody can claim discrimination even if it hasn't objectively happened.
Oh, well, there's a very good, well, that raises a subject we didn't touch, but it's a very important point, is when they did Brown versus Topeka was the right decision, striking down segregation. But then shortly thereafter, the courts and the political community as a whole make a big mistake. Rather than fully bring to life the 14th Amendment is fully protecting all the individual liberties of everyone,
Mm.
they instead turned into a group identity document where the 14th Amendment only protects group identity rights and group identity rights that come not from your individuality as a human being, but that the states give you. So
Mm.
as a result, you can sue over discrimination that the state does if you're able to label yourself the proper victim group, but simply, hey, they violated my rights. You know, the federal government needs to do something about it. That's not how they've applied the 14th Amendment. They make it all about the group identity, which means so many things the state and locales do wrong, they get away with it. And it taints us with the whole idea of group identity. It actually codifies in the law group identity is the way we view humanity, and we even look at groups of human beings as a victim group, which again takes away from nobility, because as we've understood, as we've already discussed, we had this noble history where the Black community was being triumphant even in the face of segregation and murder. And
Mm.
you're robbing, and you're saying, oh no, you're nothing but victims. And you take away that whole heroic story.
Mm. Um, David King has a question. How do we as a society and a nation deal with the fact that outside forces can use our founding principles against us to undermine us by not adhering to them on their own while assuming that we will? Is there a way to counter that asymmetrical warfare from abroad while still upholding our principles? He says, I suspect the founders never imagined that powers across the sea could have such immediate influence on our culture. So I guess it's a, the good guys have to follow the rules. That's why they're the good guys, and bad guys don't have to follow the rules. But if you abandon the rules, you're not the good guys anymore. And what do we
Well,
do about that?
actually, our rules don't get in the way of anything we actually need to do to make us safer. In fact, one of the great things in warfare today with high technology is what we call effects. That's basically the communication warfare going on. And one of the things China and Russia really do is attack us on the fact that we're a poisoned, divided society, and they do all they can to fuel that themselves. They actually have, social media devices they do to try to fuel our disagreement. So the greatest protection from it is those founding principles. And like
Right.
if we had wise political leaders, they would actually be openly speaking these natural law principles, both to our own culture to help heal it, but also to our opponents. Use our technology to get to the Chinese people and communicate to them, look, your government denies you your individual liberties, denies you your individual nobilities. And that's actually one of the ways we make ourselves safer, is actually through these principles. They're actually a great, powerful truth, not just internally, but against our foes. They're actually a powerful weapon against tyrants around the world if we would use it. But it starts with reconnecting them with ourselves.
I agree. Yeah. Yeah. I think they become more important when we are faced with an opposition that has abandoned them. We should hold even faster to them, I think. It might make the conflict more difficult on our end, but I think it's worthwhile. So here's an interesting question. I'll try to summarize it. I think that the reality that I'm assuming it's diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice principles have great value when they're used appropriately, and they're likely here to stay anyway, because of course there are fundamental values within those that we should care about. Should we maybe rather than taking an either or approach, is it possible to take a both and approach and promote a model foundation for civic progress that includes all diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice components that other people are interested in, but pairing them with complementary concepts for necessary balance? So basically, rather than framing ourselves as being in opposition to everything that they want, quote unquote, maybe finding some way to say, listen, we agree with what you're trying to do. Here's what we're trying to do and how it relates.
Oh, that's actually what I was doing, in effect, because see, that's one of the problems is the conservative crowd that's legal positive. They just tell the left when cries for justice, talk to the hand. I'm not denying the cry for justice, and I'm not denying the great injustices. What I'm saying is that rather than recriminations, revenge, and tearing down the social structure, is that these healing principles of the founding fathers is the real way we can get their justice.
Right.
I don't sit there and say, like some do on the right, and say that every time somebody says there's police brutality, deny it, like some do. But but with the founding principles, it would say don't do instant judgment. Take it each case by case to see if someone did wrong there. But it's because we're not going to deny anybody's full humanity, which means both we won't instantly claim a police officer did wrong. We'll see if this individual did, because we're not going to automatically assume an officer's a racist. I would also say that in most of these cases, it's a fundamental leadership problem, because it goes back to how we have political elites who don't really believe in these founding principles. And so politically, it's usually easy to get away with not properly doing right by poor communities.
Right.
And so it's this fundamental lack of adherence to these founder principles, which drives so many of these issues like police brutality and so forth, even more than racism. It's just this fundamental lack of those principles, because a lot of it has to do with, if you lack political power, we don't care about you, whatever skin color you are.
Right.
We often term everything today in skin color because we have that history of racism.
Right.
But again, I think this is the kind of thing you're going to have when we're all about group identity and we're not about those founding fathers' principles. We're going to have a lot of injustice. And until we get back to those founding principles, the injustice is going to grow.
Right. It seems to me that recognizing that the founding principles are integral to any attempts to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice, and that without them we can get incredibly divisive concepts and divisive manifestations of those pursuits.
See, because look at what they're failing to recognize is, like, for instance, if we could only just simply get them to enforce the 14th Amendment the way it was originally intended to be, you don't need a new law. You need the courts and politicians just recognizing the truth about the 14th Amendment. And like I said, so many times the injustices go unaccountable because this group identity victim card means you have to actually prove racism. You don't just prove I had my rights violated. Most of the time you have to prove it was racially motivated. And it's because of my group identity card is why you did it, rather than just I had a right, you violated it, I win.
Right. We do have, yeah, we did have a question about what case or law you were referring to that roots the 14th Amendment in group identity.
Oh, it's almost all 14th Amendment interpretation since Brown versus Topeka. You want to look at the everything from the affirmative action cases, the 1983 lawsuits. Like, for instance, we have statutes that enforce, that are the mechanism for you to sue legally over the 14th Amendment. In 1983 is the classic one you sue over. The statute doesn't require you to prove racial animus, but what happens, the courts have interpreted in most cases, you're going to have to prove racial animus. And just like so we're talking about dozens of cases. And it even goes the other way. We've created new rights that weren't recognized because that are essentially group identity rights that are recognized to violate individual liberty. So the courts as a whole don't recognize this, because here's our split. When you hear conservative in the courts today, that, except for Clarence Thomas, it means you reject that the Declaration is the founding document. And most of that crowd wants to act like the 14th Amendment virtually means nothing. And then when you look at the left, most of them want to say it's all about group identity and only group identity.
Well, Johnny, it's been awesome chatting with you. We have a question about where does Marxism fit into all of this? I feel like that's probably subject for an entire webinar on its own, but if you have a quick answer to how Marxism fits into all of this stuff we've been talking about.
Well, so much of when I've said left, the negative side of left is actually the Marxist side of left, because there's the positive side of left that came from William James Bryant and the progressives of the late 19th century and their social reform movement that wasn't statist. It's this statist left usually means Marx. There's also statist right, which comes from the old Hegelians and all that. And Hitler was an example of statist right as well. And also specifically, the Marxists were the ones who specifically first said that the fundamental theme of American history is racism, not liberty.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's plenty to mine there, I'm sure, but it's been a fascinating time.
Oh, my wife just got here.
Oh, well,
pretty late, but better late than never.
Well, Suziann, you could come on and say hello and goodbye with us. I'm sorry you couldn't be here for the whole conversation.
Yeah,
it'll be nice to see you.
Yeah.
Hi, Suziann.
Hello, sir. How are you doing?
Good. Yeah.
Sorry,
so we're just wrapping up here, but it's great. It's great that we got to see you at least a little bit.
It's good to see you too. I was actually here 30 minutes ago, but I didn't want to interrupt the interview back and forth. He was so deeply in thought and answering the questions. I didn't want to just bring a chair around, but I was listening, and it's quite interesting, the subject matter and everything.
Well, next time we'll make sure that you're on, and we'll focus on you instead.
There's one thing I really want my wife to be able to say, is what I mentioned to her earlier about my speaking in the Black churches and the story you told earlier. Tell them about that story real quick.
Sure. Okay. So my husband, as you can see, is a very, very knowledgeable man when it comes to history, and he has a very strong perspective about Black and white and group identity and the founding fathers and the history of this country. And what really sets Johnny apart from most people I've met is his goals to set people straight as far as with the truth. So he does that at Black churches. He did that at my church, Breakthrough Deliverance Church of God, many years ago. And he did that in Alabama at the Black churches, saying the truth, about the that people are created in the image of God, people in general, and we shouldn't really focus on black and white and those sorts of things. It creates this divide. It creates this
Sure.
this static, and it's quite negative.
Mm.
And so one thing that I really liked about Johnny is how at this one meeting, this gentleman really had tears in his eyes. He really expressed how Black men nowadays should really not be so focused on the racism. It's not all Caucasian people that really want this divide and this segregation and fighting against each other. And, you know, not everybody has this hate. So, you know, it was just that special moment. You know, I haven't been to all of the services when he was talking, but this one particular service, he had this gentleman really, he really hit home to this one gentleman at church. It was this Black guy and from Jamaica. And I don't think he's ever come across a gentleman like Johnny, a Caucasian man, to really express and tell the truth about the importance of not looking so much at the negative, but to express love. And it's not all white people that express racism. As you can see, we've been married now almost 8 years, been together for 9. And our life together express love, and we want people to see that, you know, with how we live and how we interact with others. So
Thank you, baby.
you're
That's
welcome.
really nice.
That's what I want to share. He has a lot more knowledge of all the
Oh yeah, yeah.
the matter, you know, because my background is actually sports, you know.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah, you know, so it's quite interesting. I love to learn from my husband about history and where we are as a nation and where we're going, and what needs to be done. There's a lot needs to be done.
Sure.
I commend your group Fair for being so open to share this. This is so positive. You know, a lot of people could really benefit from this. And, you know, a lot of people don't have it squared away and have the truth, you know, and people need the truth nowadays. And importantly, people need the love of God. You know, the founding fathers, one thing I did admire about them, especially George Washington, they had a strong faith in God. And with God, you know, you will understand how to express and live righteously with other people, and just doing the right thing with your neighbors, with your country. It's so important. You know, we don't want to forget that because of all the chaotic things that's going on all over the world.
Yeah.
You know, but one thing we can learn is from, you know, we can learn a lot from history. Thank you for listening to me.
Oh no, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'm glad we got to chat with you a little bit.
Thank
and
you.
Johnny, thank you so much. This was a fascinating conversation, and thank you all for watching and listening. And we'll see you next time.
Oh, you're welcome. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.